Good afternoon, everybody. I am Jen Fagan-Fry. I am the NOAA Institutional Repository Manager. I am here with my colleague, Sarah Davis, who is our Senior Bibliometrics Librarian, and she also assists with the repository. This is, what are we on, number three of our IR Brown Bag series. Today we are going to go over requirements specifically for Cooperative Institutes and Grantees. I'm just going to dive in. I will say we are recording this. We will put it up on the library's Brown Bag website, probably within the next day or two. And if you have any questions, as always, you can hold them until the end, and then you can always email myself or Sarah after the fact. So, are we not working? I turned it off. I know, I just turned it back on. There we go. Thank you, Katie. So just very briefly, our agenda today, we're going to go over what governs the institutional repository, the language and requirements from all the directives that govern the repository. We are going to cover the submission process for grantees and cooperative institutes. And then we wanted to leave ample time for questions. We assumed a lot of people had very specific questions, so we're going to try to leave as much time as possible for that. As always, I'm going to start with what the repository is. By now, I'm sure everybody knows, but the repository is a free digital library of NOAA-funded and NOAA-authored research. You can access it through repository.library.noaa.gov. You can also access it through the library's website. From our main site, there is a tab on the homepage, and then we also have a specific institutional repository page via our research tools page. So to start, we're going to talk about what governs the institutional repository. The institutional repository started with the OSTP memo that requires agencies that conduct over $100 million in research annually to create a public access plan and to make the results of all research available to the public. This was put out in February of 2013. NOAA's response to this was the NOAA PARR plan. This lays out NOAA's plan for making publications and data publicly accessible and calls for the development of a publications policy as well as the development of the NOAA Institutional Repository. The publications policy and the data directive, these two documents were created after the PARR policy, the PARR plan, and they further detail the roles and responsibilities of NOAA authors, researchers, offices, what the library is responsible for. And all of those were broadly laid out in the NOAA PARR plan, and then the data directive and the publications policy narrow those down and call out things specifically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these items, each of these directives and policies, and cover exactly what is required for grantees, cooperative institutes, people who've received funding via contracts, and the like. So we're going to start with the PARR plan. In the PARR plan, section 7.1 discusses grantee-specific tasks. The NOAA PARR plan, I will say, is in the institutional repository. You can search for it. If you just type in PARR, it'll be your first result. Everything is linked here in this presentation, so when you go to it online after the recording, you will be able to access all these documents that we're discussing. Okay. So as I said, 7.1 discusses grantee-specific tasks for data and publications requirements. We'll talk a little bit more about data, but I'm really going to just focus on what it says about publications since this is related to the repository. So I am going to highlight just a couple of the things here. It's a pretty lengthy section, but it lists everything out in bullet points for what is expected and required for any grantee. Some of the main highlights are specifying funding sources. The PARR plan states, quote, grantees shall be required to specify funding sources using the FundRef mechanism when papers are submitted for publication, end quote, or via a funding statement. and that grantees shall, quote, be required to submit a digital copy of final pre-publication manuscripts to the NOAA Institutional Repository, which is reiterated under section 7.2.1 in the PARR plan. So the two main points to take away from that: if you receive a grant or are a cooperative institute, you need to cite your funding source somewhere in the document. There are some, either via FundRef, or there are some examples of some funding statements that you can use in the NOAA administrative order for grants. I'm sorry, I'll get that information on here and I'll add that to the slide before we post this. There are also a handful of examples kind of from other NOAA publications as to how to cite that. We use that information when we enter metadata into, or when we enter the metadata for all these items. So if you provide your funding information, we link all of those grant numbers to the item in the repository, so that if someone were to look for something based on just a grant number, every publication that was funded by that grant will come up in their search. And so that's why we want to emphasize putting in your funding information. For the publications, we do request that you send the pre-publication final version. So the peer-reviewed pre-publication, so before any publisher added content is added, manuscript. That's what this is saying that we need. The manuscripts do need to be Section 508 compliant, which I will go into in just a little bit. So we will cover Section 508. So for the data directive, the data directive, or the data and publication sharing directive for NOAA grants, cooperative agreements, and contracts, which is the full name. I'm just going to call it the data directive. The data directive, quote, does not apply to FFO announcements and contract solicitations published before June 1st, 2016, or to grants, cooperative agreements, or contracts funded as a result of an announcement published before that date. So if your grant or the like was published or solicited before June 1st of 2016, PARR does not apply to it. There is a previous version of the data directive that applies to those documents, though, and I've linked that here. It's version 2. The current data directive is version 3, which is the top link. The data directive also mentions funding acknowledgments. This is in section B-3 of the data directive, and it states that federal funding sources shall be identified in all scholarly publications. It also goes on to state that the relevant grant programs and award numbers should also be stated, should also be noted using FundRef as well. And then finally, the data directive does mention manuscripts and manuscript submission. It says also in section B3, which again, I've cited all of this here, all of this is linked. The final pre-publication manuscript of all scholarly publications shall be submitted to the NOAA Institutional Repository. For the publication policy, this is pretty short because it focuses just on publications. It focuses solely on the publications that are to be included in the NOAA IR by defining what are considered NOAA research publications. So the publications policy says, this is what a NOAA research publication is, this is what you should be submitting to us. So the policy defines a research publication as any digital information product produced through the use of NOAA funding and intended for public or limited external distribution after the effective date of the NOAA Plan for Increasing Public Access to Results of Research, the PARR plan, and which meets the criteria shown below. This includes products created via federal staff time, through contracts with third parties, or through grants or other agreements. So if you receive NOAA money, you have to send us a copy of your manuscripts. So what you need to send the library, and these are the library requirements. We all know you have to send these things to us now. So what do we ask of you? Per PARR, the library, we manage, maintain, developed the institutional repository. So for manuscripts, again, I'm going to reiterate it. I'm sorry, I sound a little bit like a broken record, but it is the final peer-reviewed but pre-publication manuscript, except there is one caveat to this. One, if you publish in an open access journal that allows us to use the publisher's version, we can take that publisher's PDF. If it is not an open access journal, though, we would require that manuscript, that final peer-reviewed pre-publication manuscript. If you are submitting that manuscript, it must be Section 508 compliant. 4 things to be included in the institutional repository. They all must be 508 compliant. At this point, I think everyone is pretty familiar with 508 compliance. I'm going to do just a brief sort of what it is. Section 508 is a federal law. It requires that any materials that are placed on a public-facing website should be fully accessible by people with some sort of disability, such as hearing impairment, visual disability, and the like. So we look for 5 main elements when it comes to 508 compliance. I have them listed here. We call them the big 5. The document must be a tagged PDF. We ask that all images, charts, figures have alternative text behind them. And when I say alternative text, I don't mean a W. Yeah, it'll pass the PDF checker. I'll still find it and I'll still kick it back to you. A W is not descriptive text. If it's a chart of, if it's some sort of like plot graph of temperatures or whatever, just say graph of temperatures. Or if it's a picture of a fish, photograph of whatever kind of fish it is. That's it. We don't ask for super descriptive things, but if you put in a letter or the address or the file name of that the image, we will kick it back. It does need to be descriptive text. That's the point of it. The reading order for the document should be logical. You can do a visual glance of this in Adobe. You can also run it through a screen reader. Adobe does have a screen reading option called Adobe Voice, Adobe Read. It's part of the program. You can run it through and it'll run through the whole thing for you. If your document is over 20 pages, we do ask that it has bookmarks. If it is 19, you don't have to apply bookmarks. And then we also ask that you fill out the document properties. We will need the item's title and the language. Any other document properties you fill in are fantastic and gravy, and we're excited to see that. They're not required. We only focus on title and language. These are used for search engine optimization, which makes your document more findable. All items should be submitted via one of 2 submission methods, which Sarah's going to go over in a little bit more detail when we in just a few minutes. There is the email, which is noaa.repository@noaa.gov, or you can submit via our submission form, which is linked here, but to do that, you do have to have a NOAA.gov email address. There are a couple kinds of documents that we accept. We accept, of course, journal articles, which is mostly what we've been talking about. I did not put up here because it doesn't always apply to grantees and CIs, but we do take NOAA series publications, tech memos, tech reports, and the like. If you receive funding from NOAA, we will also take your thesis or your dissertation. Things we will not take. Some grants ask that you submit things like posters, pamphlets, presentations that you've done. Those are not things we include in the repository. The repository is strictly for research publications, and they are not specifically named in either PARR or the publications policy, so we do not take them. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, and she is going to talk a little bit more about that submission.
Great. Hi. Now that you know what the policy requires that you submit, I'm going to tell you how to do that. We know that different offices and programs are handling submissions differently. Some are requiring that the authors submit publications themselves. Others have a single person coordinating those efforts and submitting everything together. We have no opinions on the best way to do this, but we are more than willing to work with any office or individual trying to figure out the best way to get publications to us. As in all things here, we are here to help. As Jen mentioned, there are 2 submission methods. I'm going to get to those in a minute, but first I'm going to talk about how you find those submission methods. The most expedient is probably the submit button on the IR homepage. It's just right there on the top on the navigation bar. It's present on every page in the IR. There's also, from the IR homepage, a little drop-down menu about NOAA Institutional Repository, and under that is a link to the FAQs. These are the brief version of the FAQs. We don't have, hold up. Or does that need to be? The CDC edits the IR webpage, so we try not to have everything quite as in-depth because we can't make changes with, great expediency. But we have these brief FAQs. They cover what the basics of the PARR policy are, what publications are required, and how to submit. There are links to the IR submission form as well as the IR email for any questions or submissions. There's also a link to the NOAA page with IR extended facts. So from the library's website, there's a tab for the institutional repository, and on that tab there's a link to the repository itself, so you can do searches or start from there with the submission button. And there's also links to the submission form and the extended FAQs. The extended FAQs we do try to keep updated as we're getting more questions, so it's good to check there. We have more depth about all of the questions and information on things like Section 508 compliance and including data sets in your submissions. And again, under how do I submit my materials, more links to the submission form, the IR email, and the batch submission template that we'll be discussing in a moment. So our preferred method of submission is using the submission form. It's a Google form that really walks you through the process of submitting either single items or batches of publications, and also allows you to resubmit documents that are already in the IR if you find an error and need to update it or change any of the links. Unfortunately, the form requires a NOAA Gmail address, and so authors outside of NOAA, a lot of grantees won't be able to access this option. So they should use the email. It's easy. What we need from this is to have a full citation of the document or documents being submitted. We need a primary contact person. We always need a primary contact person. And the document itself, either as a PDF attachment or as a shared Google Drive. And for either through the form or via email, you can submit using the batch template that we've provided. It ensures that we get all the information that we need to create proper metadata before we upload items into the IR. It's as simple as selecting the document type and then entering the appropriate document details and columns. I will note, not every column will be filled in for every document. There's different requirements for articles and NOAA publications. Sometimes you have additional information that you want to include, like grant numbers or Cooperative Institute names. Also, this is where you would include data set links if you have them. So we've provided a second tab in the template with a glossary of all the column headings to help you figure out what each column means and which one applies to your documents. And as always, if you have any questions, you can email us at the repository email or email Generi, and we will try to help you through this. If you're very new to the process, we can get on the phone with you and walk you through it. To use the template, we suggest that you make a copy rather than using the one that's online and then adding your information before sharing it with us. We request that you submit journal articles and NOAA publications separately because they are handled a little bit differently, and we'll expedite the process. We also, as a reminder, we do still need all the documents, no matter how you're submitting it. If it's in an Excel form, if you're emailing it to us, if you're using the form requires that you include the documents, but just be prepared. We always need the actual document. If you just want to share it on the Google Drive, that's a perfectly nice way to do that. Very quick for us. So that about sums it up, and we are ready to take questions. Any questions from the room? Yeah.
Your last slide, you said download forms, and there was something else before you needed to do all the actual documents. What was the second thing?
Oh, we ask that you submit journal articles and NOAA publications separately. This is less of an issue, probably, we suspect, for grant programs and CIs, but in general, those are handled through two slightly different streams. And it is best for everyone if they are kept slightly separate.
You said dissertations are accepted. Those are typically copyrighted, or is there any formatting restrictions that we have to follow to get around the copyright rules on a dissertation?
There's a question in the room about submitting dissertations and whether or not they are copyrighted. We're still working through this. We talked to General Counsel at some point, and they said, yeah, we can put that in. They're subject to the same rules. We probably will have to look at these on an individual basis, but I know that we have accepted dissertations. So, yes.
If I could add, it doesn't remove the author's copyright. The author always retains the copyright, but under my understanding is, as a provision of the grant, you know, if they're supposed to submit their dissertation, we have the right to put it in the IR.
But again, it would need to be that manuscript version, not whatever they sent to ProQuest.
Dissertations and theses, a similar condition to journal articles may apply in some, if not all, cases where we need the manuscript and not whatever ProQuest has put together and made available on their database.
We have a few questions online. If someone has a very descriptive caption, can they reuse that as alt text, or is that fine?
The question is about if someone has a descriptive caption and if they can reuse that as their alternative text. While this isn't typically a best practice, we have been accepting it. We have done that in some of our materials. It's not necessarily a 508 best practice, but you can do that, yes. Mm-hmm.
There's a question about if there's a Word template that makes the document elements more straightforward.
So the question was, is there a Word template that makes the document elements more straightforward? So just for clarification, I'm assuming that person is referring to making their manuscript or their item Section 508 compliant, correct? Okay, if that's the case, not yet. We don't have a template just yet. On Thursday, this week Thursday, the 21st at 2 p.m., I am going to be doing another Section 508 workshop, a hands-on workshop. It's via webinar only, so please don't come to the library, but you can log in online. I am going to go through and create an entire document. It will be in the format of a tech memo, but same principles apply to any sort of manuscript. I will be creating a whole document from scratch, and it will be Section 508 compliant. When I am done with it, there will be a very generic technical memorandum template that I am going to post on the Section 508 LibGuide that people can use, can copy from, can steal if they would like, and complete. I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, put some more details in there, and we'll try to answer it better. Go ahead.
I have a question from the grantor side. So my program doesn't receive, is not a grantee, but we make grants.
Yes.
Is there anything defined about, do we have a responsibility in making sure materials produced and
So I want to say yes, but I need to. Oh, I'm sorry. The question, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. The question was not from the grantee side, but the grantor side. So do those offices and programs have any specific requirements themselves to make sure that things are getting into the repository? My short answer is yes. Where it is and what it specifically states within PARR, I don't have right off the top of my head. In PARR, and as I mentioned in the publications policy and the data directive, it does specifically lay out the responsibilities of each party. So whether it's the author, the office, and the library, so you can even see what we are supposed to be doing. What I can do is find that information. I can toss that into an additional slide here, and before we post the slides, we'll put that information in there as well. Michael?
Yeah, I have a question about incorporating this into grant and contract language.
Yeah.
Is this being written into grants now? Is there language available if you're going to write a contract or grant?
That is an amazing question. The question was, is this information and these requirements written into current grant language, and if there is a plan to put it into future grant language? Unfortunately, I don't have a yes or no for you. I have there is some aspects of this written into current grants, specifically regarding the repository and those requirements. As far as I understand, it is not in grant language right now. We have been trying to get into those conversations and to have all of that grant information updated, so that all of that is listed. But at this point in time, we are hoping people are incorporating that, but none of that is ever sent to us. We don't ever see that language before it's posted widely. If someone is writing a grant, we would love to advise as to what language could and should be used. Sarah and I are working on kind of developing some sort of standard statements that we'd like to see in some of those, and we can provide those to people. But right now, I don't have a great yes or no answer for that. It should, yes, it should be in there. Is it? Maybe?
There's some language in the grants data sharing procedural directive
right.
that is supposed to be included in FFOs.
Right.
That language is potentially incomplete with respect to 508 requirements.
That is correct.
And I think it depends on the grant officer. I know our grant officer has said, you failed to include this language, you must include it before the FFO will be authorized.
Exactly. So it, for those who couldn't hear that on the phone, it was said it sort of also depends on the office. Some offices have included some of that language, some have not. Some of them include things about 508, which should be included, since these are things that are coming to a federal agency. As a federal agency, we are required to make all of our materials Section 508 compliant. Sorry, I feel like a really bad broken record. Yes, you're correct. Some offices are doing it, some are not. I know that they had recently revised the data and publication sharing directive, and we had seen what they were putting in there. There were some things that we asked that they changed. I don't think they were changed. Specifically, some of the information was incorrect about the repository address and who's responsible for managing it. So
I think at that point, 508 was a footnote.
yeah,
We would like it to not be a
not
footnote.
be a footnote, be actual part of
It's
it.
quite important. But that process, I believe, got hung up. So this hasn't quite been approved yet, as far as we are aware. So we're talking more to grant offices themselves about.
Do you have more questions? Okay, shoot. We have plenty of time, so.
Is the library or the IR still okay with submitting batch EndNote library files? And if so, do you have any tips or requirements?
Hi. This question about submitting EndNote batches, which was our original preferred source of batch submissions. We are still accepting them. They're a little less than ideal, but if you are including them, I would suggest linking to a Google Drive document rather than attaching the PDFs to the library itself, because it makes a very, very large file if it's just full of PDFs. And perhaps talking to us about what metadata to include, because that has been part of the problem, is that we get slightly different metadata on our end.
When there are two or more authors, co-authors on a paper that are both federal employees and Cooperative Institute employees, how do you determine who submits the document and what requirements apply?
There's a question about having two or more NOAA authors on a document and determining who submits the document. We are not really making that decision, because a lot of our documents are coming from the offices themselves. There is no harm in a submission, like multiple submissions of the same document. We check. We're not going to put duplicates up in the IR. I'm very careful. So it comes down to, hopefully you can work it out among yourselves. Our general best practice is the first author listed is the one who submits. But when in doubt, submit again.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff is curious as to why you need the pre-publication versions and not the DOI from the publisher. Does it have anything to do with copyright or 508 compliance?
The question is why we ask for the pre-publication manuscript, and should the DOI for the publisher's version be included, and why we require that version. So we require the pre-publication manuscript because of copyright. There are copyright restrictions on a lot of things, which if the document is open access, those copyright things are kind of waived and moot at that point. We do ask that when you submit a manuscript or even the open access version, that you please include a link to the publisher's version via the DOI. We do link to that. So if you send us a manuscript, we always link to the publisher's version on their website. That's part of the requirements of PARR. That is part of good copyright practice. And that's just us being diligent with our metadata and with providing access to the research. So if you have a manuscript, please give us the DOI for the publisher's version, because we do include that information. Any more questions online?
Any more questions in the room?
I guess if someone forgets to submit their pre-publication and we don't find out about it, and all they have is their final version, I'm assuming, hopefully the pre-publication version exists, but if it doesn't exist in that case, we just have the link. Has that ever come up?
So it has come up. So the question is, what if the pre-publication version was never submitted? The office or program only has the final version, and we can't get our hands on the pre-publication version. What do we do? The repository is intended as a document repository, so for everything we do require a document. If for whatever reason we cannot get a hold of the pre-publication manuscript and we cannot use the final version, unfortunately we just can't put that item into the repository. Hopefully that isn't the case. Hopefully people would be able to get their hands on that. Again, always check if it's open access, we can take that version, but unfortunately that would be a thing we'd have to unfortunately omit from the repository.
I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
About publishing. Jeff is saying that he's co-located CI working in NOAA facilities. They're required to pass through local NOAA review processes. Should they assume that the NOAA lab is submitting, and that is the requirement for them, regardless if a federal employee is an author?
There's a question from online about whether or not co-located CIs, so people working alongside NOAA authors and who have to go through the lab review process for their publication, if they should assume that the lab is submitting their documents. I would never assume that someone else is submitting your documents. You can check with them, you can check with us. As I said before, when in doubt, submit again. We will check. That's it. And there's also a comment I see about it is very hard to get the pre-published version. We do understand that. And we have been exploring ways to try to get around that. So far we haven't found anything. So we understand that is difficult. We don't particularly expect to ever have 100% compliance because of that, because that is a big hurdle to get over.
Yeah, Jeff followed up with wondering about number of reports. Fisheries management councils, are they required to submit this?
There's a question about requirements to submit reports as opposed to journal articles or theses. I would check the grant language. If it's something that you're required to submit to the grant, it is something you're required to submit to the IR. It is a research product from NOAA funding. So I would say yes.
When in doubt, you can always email us at the NOAA.repository account and say, is this something I need to submit? And we will always take a look at it and give you a yes or no.
One more.
Yep.
Susan wants to know, if one receives NOAA funding and you have to publish in the IR, the caveat is that if you publish in an open access journal, it doesn't have, she's wondering if it doesn't have to be Section 508 compliant if it's in an open access journal.
The question is about open access journals, and if you have to, if you publish in an open access journal and you submit to the IR, does it have to be Section 508 compliant? This is our one caveat to 508 compliance as well. No. If we can use the publisher's version, we will use it as it is. Because it is a publisher's version and it is copyrighted, we can't alter that item. Sometimes when you make things 508 compliant, you do have to alter some things. So that is our one and only caveat for Section 508 compliance. If we are able to use the publisher's version, you do not have to do any 508 remediation for that item. Any more questions?
I do have one more question.
Go ahead, sir.
Your update in IR entry, that was a new thing on your form.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
For linking data associated with publications when the link comes in after the fact,
Yes.
is the preference to do it through the form or the email? I mean, I've historically been doing it through email. I just wasn't sure if that was easier.
Sure. So the question was in regards to, on the submission form, there's a new option for resubmitting a link or resubmitting, I forget the exact wording, resubmit a document or something. And the question was about submitting a data set link after the fact. Sometimes you get the DOI well after you've submitted your publication or whatever it may be. And the best way to get that to us, you can submit it via that form. You can also submit it via email. We will take it either way, whatever works best for you. If you are adding a data set link, if say your publication is already in the repository, but now you have your DOI for your data set, all we would need to know is either the title or the URL for that item in the repository. Remember that all repository documents have a unique URL. So you can just grab that when you find it in the repository from that landing page, drop it in the email and say, this is the data set link for this document in the repository. We will link them up and then you're good to go. Doing it via email sometimes is easier for some people. You can do it through that new through the new button on the submission form. We are good with either way. We just want to make sure we get that link in there. Anybody else? Okay. If anything comes up, as always, please feel free to email the repository account, myself, Sarah, and then we will, another shout out for the 508 workshop, Thursday at 2. There is, in regards to that, there is a, I created a form. If you have specific questions, please fill out that form. It is linked on the brown bag page for that specific event. Go ahead and submit a question. I'm going to try to get to as many as I can and address as many as I can. It is an hour-long session, unlike the last one, which was only 30 minutes. If you have questions please submit them in the question panel. I'll go over all that again, but just a quick shout out for that, because we did have a number of 508 questions today. And then Sarah and I will have another one of these in 2 more months, in August. So, but if you have anything come up before then, let us know. And if not, we'll see you all in August. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.